Ok, buonasera, benvenuti a tutti voi sul programma in diretta e tutti alla Fondazione Cini. Sono felicissima di dare il benvenuto alla 12ª conferenza annuale IAS Kress. Hello, welcome. I'm so delighted to welcome all of you, both online and... Ok, buonasera, benvenuti a tutti voi sul programma in diretta e tutti alla Fondazione Cini. Sono felicissima. Scusa, era una... mi sente?
Sì, la sentiamo.
Ok, prova di nuovo. Era un conflitto lì, scusami. Allora, buonasera, benvenuti a tutti voi sul programma in diretta su YouTube e alla Fondazione. Sono Tenley Bick, professoressa in Storia dell'Arte all'Università Statale della Florida, da dove vi parlo oggi, e presidentrice dell'IAS, Italian Art Society, una società professionale dedicata allo studio e alla ricerca nel campo della storia dell'arte e dell'architettura italiana, dalla preistoria ad oggi. La conferenza si conviene ogni anno, per promuovere scambi internazionali tra gli studiosi in storia dell'arte italiana in Nord America e quelli in Italia, specializzati in storia dell'arte dei periodi prima dell'Ottocento. Hello, I'm Tenley Bick, professor in art history at Florida State University, from where I speak to all of you today. I am also the president of the Italian Art Society, which is a professional academic organization dedicated to the study and research in history of art and of architecture in Italy from prehistory to today. A conference that we hold every year with the Kress Foundation convenes in order to promote international exchanges between historians of Italian art in North America and those in Italy, with particular attention for the Kress Foundation's interest in the history of art before the 19th century. I'm going to make some initial comments, both initially in Italian, and then I will present them in English. Our lecture will also be in English today, but in the spirit of exchange, I wanted to make bilingual remarks. Soprattutto vorrei ringraziare la Fondazione Kress e la Fondazione Giorgio Cini per il sostegno per questo programma e per l'ospitalità a Venezia. In particolare vorrei ringraziare Simone Guerrio e Simone Tolmin per l'assistenza nell'organizzazione dell'evento e la Cini per il disegno della bellissima locandina e il direttore Luca Massimo Barbaro. Vi siamo molto grati. Vorrei anche ringraziare i nostri partners istituzionali. Eccoci. Vi prego di fare il clic sulla codice QR per imparare della società e per iscrivervi alla società. Ora per introdurre la nostra oratrice. L'oratrice stasera è della conferenza 2023 è Jody Cranston, professoressa ordinaria in storia dell'arte del Rinascimento presso l'Università di Boston. La dottoressa Cranston è l'autrice del tomo Green Worlds of Renaissance Venice da Penn State University Press 2019. Questa sua conferenza viene dalla sua seconda monografia intitolata Animal Sightings, Art, Animals and Court Culture, 1400 to 1550, in arrivo nel 2025 anche dal Penn State University Press. Presenterà stasera il suo intervento intitolato The Worn Animal, Furs and Perfume in Early Modern Venetian Art. Now to introduce our speaker in English. Dr. Jody Cranston is professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Boston University. She is the author of Green Worlds of Renaissance Venice. Her paper today is related to research undertaken for her second and forthcoming monograph entitled Animal Sightings, Arts, Animals, and Court Culture, 1400 to 1550, which is scheduled to be published by Penn State University Press in 2025. I'm so sorry I can't be there with you, but I am looking forward to our expanded access and possibilities of joining you online and really convening a truly international event. With that, I leave the stage to Dr. Cranston. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me in the room? Closer to me? Okay. It's a great honor to be the speaker for this year's Italian Art Society and Kress Lecture at this really memorable location. I've never had to take a boat to give a lecture, but I think it should be a regular thing. Thank you to the Fondazione Cini for hosting the lecture, and also to Professor Tenley Bick for organizing the event and providing two really nice introductions, which is also a unique feature of this event. I greatly appreciate your time and effort, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity. Early modern courts acquired and kept animals for hunting and for companionship. They also actively sought out and circulated a range of products made from animals. Furs of marten, sable, ermine, squirrel, and fox, among others, gloves made from a variety of animal skins, and musk generated from civet cats and other animal sources were received and processed in Venice and worn in court environments, as well as worn by a significant number of individuals who self-consciously engaged in luxurious display and courtly behavior beyond the physical space of those courts, especially in Venice. Wearing animal products was not, of course, an innovation of or limited to early modern Italy. Furs and civet had been procured for at least several centuries beforehand, with the establishment of specific trade routes and political alliances. And leather for gloves and some types of fur were readily available from local sources. Despite this relatively continuous supply, these animal products made a noticeable increase in their appearance in artworks, specifically paintings executed in the later 15th and early 16th centuries in Venice, and particularly in the work of Titian. Which is not to say that human figures bedecked in furs and gloves were absent from artworks by other artists before that time frame. Wealthy patrons made consistent showings with their fur coats and hats in manuscript illuminations and in paintings, especially in Northern European art. One of many examples is the depiction of the month of January in the Très Riche Jours de Duc de Berry, which includes fur-lined coats and fur hats worn at a hunting banquet. But for a few decades, around the turn of the 16th century, furs, both on clothing as well as handheld furs such as muffs and pelts, gloves and musk, and specifically the pomanders and jewelry used for carrying those scents, became more prevalent in portrait-type paintings in particular. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the long-standing role of Venice in the fur trade and market, Venetian painters, and Titian in particular, executed a preponderance of these artworks. Some of the sitters belonged to established courts in northern Italy. Unidentified others appear to be trying to establish a courtly identity, like Titian's man in a red cap. All, though, are portrayed with worn animal products at a time when the supply of new furs was somewhat compromised by shifts in trade routes and dwindling ecological resources. Filling the supply gap were secondhand furs, which were widely available to and circulated among a growing number of socioeconomic groups. Wealth and status oftentimes facilitated the initial acquisition of these animal products, but were not absolutely necessary, and certainly not necessary in order to wear them. Such historical circumstances undermine the art historical interpretations of the depiction of these worn animal products solely and dependably as signs of the sitter's wealth and status. In fact, worn garments of any material bear a far more complex relationship to the wearer than formulaically signifying just one aspect of identity. Clothes not only give form to the human body, but also shape and mold the identity and subjectivity of the wearer of the garments. Early modern clothes, as Anne Rosalind Jones and Peter Sallybrass have argued, were invested with a mnemonic potential. capable of carrying the personal history and longing of and for the wearer. Jones and Sallybrass, like many scholars of actual and represented clothing, have found methodological inspiration from thing theory, which in its most general application advocates a rethinking of the divisional hierarchy established between subject and object, and thereby articulates the ways in which objects appear to act with the agency usually attributed to humans, and positions humans as objects. Wearing animals heightens this complex dynamic of agency between human and object even more than manufactured luxury fabrics such as velvet and brocade. Animal products are made from living creatures that, as was the case for all the worn items other than civet, had to be killed in order to be used. Their once animate state hovers as the horizon for their new uses and complicates their status as an inanimate thing that can be straightforwardly marshaled for human use, as has been done for our portraits by limiting depicted animal products to abstract and lifeless symbols or signs. The animal studies scholar Erica Fudge characterized this fluid situation through her phrase of the animal-made object, which accounts for the object constructed from an animal that has the potential for agency and for shaping and defining our so-called human worlds. This reliance and inseparability can be located in the artworks themselves, where the division between human and animal is obscured through the rendering of how fur meets flesh. And where bejeweled zibellini and pomanders, the zibellini here, the zibellini and pomander here, filled with musk, together enact their talismanic power of an animal worn to effect a desired outcome for the human wearer, where these interactions and objects imply the senses of touch and smell associated with animal products by early modern wearers. Given the prevalence of the depiction of animal products in Venetian portrait types, this lecture confronts the complex ways in which animals constructed and disrupted the early modern conceptions of identity and related anxieties about self-presentation in a representational mode that turned humans into painted objects that preserved the visual memory of the living sitter against the inevitability of death. Rather than relegate the animal product to the role of backdrop or symbol, this lecture considers how the animal object was highly consequential within court environments in northern Italy and Venice, through the shaping of social and economic relationships, of concepts of the body, and of scenarios of courtly love. This lecture seeks to undertake a kind of material culture of depicted animal products by bringing into focus the ways in which early modern court culture engaged with and represented animal products at a moment when their value derived not only from being treasured gifts, healers, and amulets, but also as repositories of sensory memories. In the first section of the lecture, I will discuss how animal products were processed, used, and perceived specifically in Venice and northern Italian courts. I will pay particular attention to how the wearers of animal products experience sensory memories through the items and how 16th century portraits convey these sensory memories. In the second and final section, so just two parts of the lecture, I will consider a specific item of worn fur, the zibellino or fur pelt, and specifically how depictions of it as a violent animal in portraits of women visualize the agency ascribed to the worn animal in the 16th century, particularly through lyric poetry. The worn furs that are depicted in these portrait types would have been viewed with an awareness of the complex paths taken from the living animal to the wearable product. Nearly all the furs that reached northern Italian courts arrived from the Baltic and parts of Russia and into Venice, where they were processed before being sold locally in the city or exported to other parts of Italy and Europe. Italian court members and their agents expended a considerable effort to request and acquire furs through frequent exchanges of letters, which specified the number and types of pelts sought as well as the limitations of availability and the vicissitudes of the Venetian market. Some furs, such as squirrel and fox, could be more locally sourced. The more luxurious sable, ermine, and marten were usually sourced from Russia. Venetian merchants received the deliveries of a staggering number of pelts, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, and depending on the type of fur, sent them to the appropriate master furriers who prepared the furs for their eventual use as linings and trims of garments. Most of this work, as well as any kind of animal skin tanning, took place in the more sparsely populated parts of the city, more sparsely populated then, in the Giudecca and the Rialto side of the city, in part because of an effort to relegate to the city's periphery the foul smells and other polluting byproducts of processing the dead animals. But before being sold for export and use, the pelts were perfumed to counter the strong lingering odors and often continued to be scented by the wearers of the clothing that the multiple pelts eventually lined and trimmed. The distances traveled, the multi-step process of procurement and preparation, and the relative rarity of certain types of furs contributed to their connotation of luxury. The display of ermine trim, for example, on clothing worn by the ruling and social elite, channels the efforts of its acquisition and its making into the elevated designation of the status of the wearer. Cesare Vecellio notes in his Abiti Antichi e Moderni di tutto il mondo that painters, when they wanted to represent someone of authority, painted them with fur, and that shields and coats of arms of noble families often included an emblem of furs, among other things. But at the same time, fur served the utilitarian function of providing warmth for winter coats, as well as serving as the necessary heavy backing for certain fabrics, such as brocaded velvet. Nearly everyone, except possibly members of the peasant class, would or could own some kind of fur-lined garment. This distribution and wearing of furs among all classes were widespread, but especially prevalent in Venice. Vecellio, despite his earlier comments about the upper class esteem given to fur, lays out some of these different use cases of fur, ranging from Venetian women who carry fur muffs and pelts, as you can see here, to the linings of coats of senators, merchants, here, and courtesans. Only rarely would fur cover the entire surface on the outside of the coat in northern Italy. Given Vecellio's reliance on paintings as a source material, it is not surprising that the fur fashions displayed in paintings, especially those found in Venetian portrait types, tend to align with his descriptions. The family and workshop relationship between Cesare and Titian, who were cousins once removed, also undoubtedly contributed to the overlaps. Ermine fur linings and trim often adorn the coats of politically important individuals, such as doges, dukes, and duchesses. Other types of furs can be observed through the rough seams and slashes of coats, as you can see on your right. Following the contemporary trends, which were also regularly and somewhat fruitlessly controlled through sumptuary laws. Handheld pelts referred to zibellini because they were usually made from sable fur, which you can barely see here over her arm. Drape across the shoulders and sometimes the arms of female sitters. And then this here on your right, refer to those depictions of nude female figures enrobed in fur coats that are not explicitly mentioned by Vecellio. He focuses on the clothed, not the partially clothed. Also not mentioned is how the depiction of fur in these paintings captures the tactility of the animals and evokes the idea of the once living beings. With the exception of the zibellini, which will be addressed in the second part of this lecture, none of the furs includes body parts that would make it possible to identify an intact animal. The fur garment, made up of many pelts, tens, sometimes hundreds, is not usually thought of as tens or hundreds of individual animals, but is instead thought of as a single abstracted animal. Nonetheless, the depicted furs, executed with attention to the individual hairs, seem to represent more of the animal than the lifeless pelt would in actuality. Instead, the depicted fur has a physical presence that transcends its role of clothing or containing the body. The attention given to the transition between the fur and the adjacent surface, whether another fabric or skin, visually repeats the lived experience of contact, of the beholder's body touching fur. This tactile effect was itself created by bundled tufts of actual animal fur and hair that comprised the paintbrushes, which created the depicted fur simply by having the furness of the fur do the work. A detail just showing that interaction. As Cennino Cennini instructed in his 15th century Libro dell'Arte, let us now return to the squirrel tail, which you are to take in your hand, and select the straightest and stiffest hairs from the middle of the tail. Gradually make them into small bundles. Soak them in a glass of clear water, then press and squeeze each bundle with the fingers. The animal lingers in the paintings touched by these paintbrushes. This bestial presence is precisely what many scholars have tried to argue was actively being suppressed or subverted by early modern culture. They understand the fashion of using furs for inner linings only as reflective of a broader early modern agenda of asserting human dominance over non-human animals, of culture over nature. The primary source for these arguments comes from how they interpret the moment from the book of Genesis in the Bible, when God supplies animal skins to clothe Adam and Eve after the fall. Oftentimes, the bestowal of clothing is thought of as an indication of the sinfulness of the first couple. The animal skins both conceal their nakedness and highlight their unrestrained animal natures. Parallels are sought between Adam and Eve and mythological and legendary hybrid beings associated with primitive origins, such as satyrs or wild men. But the Edenic situation is far more complex. Adam and Eve first make clothes out of fig leaves that they sew together in shamefulness after the fall. However, God reclothes them in animal skins. I've got a buzzing animal around me right now. This gesture is not so much of an indication of their sin as it is an indication of their investiture as servants of God. In reclaiming them as his subjects, God reclothed them in his livery, a livery of protection, but also a livery haunted by death. When Eve appears wrapped in fur, in some early Renaissance altarpieces placed below the seated Virgin and Child, her presence seems less about her role as a temptress and more about her punishment, mortality, and marking by God. In successive centuries, Adam and Eve were represented without any clothing, possibly, as the art historian Jill Burke has argued, because of emerging ideas about the origins of humanity. However, another biblical story involving the wearing of animal skins, that of Jacob and Esau, continued to engage Renaissance artists and kept in circulation the idea of how worn animals mark and unmark the body and its identities. The foundational biblical stories often were interpreted through and reinforced by the courtly practices of livery and investiture, whereby members of a court were given through clothing their institutional and social identities and their payment for services. These clothes were fur-lined coats, fur sleeves, and other fur accessories such as trimmed hats or hand muffs, but also included all types of clothing. Sometimes intact garments would be bestowed on the court member, but also could include parts of garments that had been repurposed into a new item or simply circulated as parts, such as sleeves. Among the best documented exchanges are those initiated by the sisters Beatrice d'Este and Isabella d'Este, who not only lavished attention and money on acquiring their own clothes, but also upcycled and recycled garments to effect social and political maneuvering. Isabella, for example, sent to Maria de Mendoza, wife of Francesco de los Covos, who was an advisor to Emperor Charles V, a sable sleeve of hers, while at the same time Isabella's son, Federico Gonzaga, sent to Maria's husband a now lost portrait of his lover that had been executed by Titian. Lucrezia Borgia, who married Isabella's brother Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, repurposed her dresses into waistcoats for pages. Like all gifts, the fur items were intended to be a sign of the giver's generosity, as well as a kind of obligation imposed on the recipient. Pietro Aretino, who received many items of clothing, especially from Federico Gonzaga, Mantua, wrote extensively and somewhat resentfully in his letters about this double bind of the gift, but especially of how clothing in particular had the power to shape physically and socially the recipient, and how the clothing retained the memory of everyone it had shaped beforehand and would afterward. Aretino wrote, "Those who imitate Federico Gonzaga are spared the fate of my lord Lorenzo de' Medici. After he died, his mother Alfonsina sold at a public auction all of his belongings, including his shifts. Thus, his best long jacket was seen on the hangman's back, to the praise and glory of the tight-fistedness of those who stray from the ways of your most excellent lordship." Bitterly exposing the complexity of the gift economy, Aretino also speaks to the mnemonics of clothing, of the ways in which social relations were embodied in worn garments. Early modern portraits bear a close relationship to these conceptions of clothing. Not only does the image type figure and shape the identity of the sitter for personal and collective memory, it also conveys these dynamics through and with attention to the dressed body. The idea that some of the depicted clothes very likely were gifted to the sitter endows the portraits with additional layers of memory, identity, and possession. All portraits, but especially portraits of richly dressed, unidentified individuals, such as, again, Titian's Man with a Red Cap, especially those unidentified individuals with uncertain provenance, perhaps could be understood as depictions of court members in second-hand gifted livery. Thinking of the ermine-trimmed coat in Titian's Man with a Red Cap, for example, as a gifted garment, could make sense for a lyrical portrait of a courtier type who possesses no clear indication of elite identity that would justify the wearing of this type of fur, such as a collection of fine things surrounding him. But even portraits of well-known individuals, such as Titian's Isabel d'Este, could include items such as the ermine pelt that very well could have been gifted to her by a family member who had previously owned and worn the item. Secondhand clothing would have enfolded additional layers of memory into the portrait. Furs were further invested with the capacity to elicit and preserve sensory memories because they also provided them. In part, the mnemonics of fur might have been facilitated by the endurance of fur fashion, which is liners and trim changed less frequently than more vulnerable outward-facing fabrics such as velvets and brocades. But as liners and trim, fur also touched the wearer more directly. Maria Savorgnan, a Venetian poetess and widow who was deeply involved in an amorous affair with Pietro Bembo for approximately 1 year, beginning in 1500, wrote to her beloved Bembo that she would never forget the feeling of drapery lined with scarlet and fur, which she mentions in the context of having her portrait painted by Bembo. There is no surviving portrait that relates to this described garment and that can be attached securely to these specific individuals, although Giorgione's Laura certainly comes to mind as a candidate, both because of the similar garment as well as the sensuousness of the fur and the elegantly encircling scarf against her nude skin. Fur garments hardly appear at all among the tropes of lyric poetry, which are often thought to inspire Venetian half-length images of sensuous women, and fur and clothing more generally certainly appear less frequently than the souvenir gloves left behind by the beloved. But medieval romances and troubadour poetry, which remained extremely popular into the 16th century, feature women who wear fur-lined coats and often await their beloveds under fur blankets. Chrétien de Troyes Guinevere, who is referred to as Ginevra in Italian translations of the Lancelot stories, lures Lancelot by standing at her bedroom window wearing only a short scarlet mantle lined with marmot fur, evoking both the garment and the half-length view depicted in Giorgione's Laura. Perhaps Maria wanted to be Bembo's Ginevra. Perhaps there is some connection between Bembo's beloved and Giorgione's Laura. Perhaps troubadour poetry exerted an influence on the visual arts previously attributed only to lyric poetry. Regardless of any type of specific identification of the source, and therefore of the female sitter, though the furs were worn, they were felt by their wearers and by their intimates, and they were imbued with sensual memory that was multidimensional and personal. Is this sensuality an experience or effect that can be constructed visually, though? Fur does nothing to articulate the physical form and contours of the body and usually conceals the body. Does the experience of sensuality arise from the visual provocation of our own memories, our remembrance of what that fur felt like? Does the experience of sensuality arise from our association of fur with sentient animals that respond to touch? Many of these paintings deepen such sensory provocation by depicting furs and skins, not simply as discrete objects, not simply placed on the skin, but as integrating with the skin and seeming to create one continuous, even woven surface. The gloves, for example, in Titian's Man with a Glove, appear almost as the skin itself, flesh-colored and tight-fitting with only a few slits to reveal the skin underneath. Similarly, the zone of connection between fur and skin, where dark material meets flesh, is not in 16th century Venetian paintings usually a neat boundary with a defined line, but is comprised of brushstrokes that cross over into the skin and vice versa. Many early modern painters with connections to Venice focused attention in their working method on these places of contact, and oftentimes use their fingers to soften or accentuate the transitions between painted fur, hair, and skin, between these surfaces and the background. Leonardo and Giovanni Bellini both employed these techniques, especially in their depictions of portrait sitters, presumably in an effort to replicate the way the eye sees and to dispense with contemporary reliance on contour lines to articulate the discreteness of individual bodies. Leonardo's painterly technique of sfumato allowed artists also to manage the problem of edges, of transitions, while at the same time acknowledging the rich potential of these contact zones to impact one another. The visual border zone of skin and fur, of human and animal skin, is also precisely the place where confusion between animate and inanimate arises, and the inanimate thing appears to approach the behavior of objects described by the early modern concept of the fetish. It is important to note, especially in the context of furs, that the early modern concept of the fetish is different from the late 19th century reliance on furs to explain the masochistic and Freudian concepts of the fetish. This distinction can often be confusing since unspecified depictions of a Venus in furs attributed to Titian play an important role in fetishistic scenarios in Leopold von Sacher-Masoch's Venus in Furs from 1870 and Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis of 1915. However, a few centuries earlier, in the 16th century, the term fetish and its meaning as an object with agency emerged and circulated in Europe. According to the influential research of William Pietz, the word fetish from the pidgin fetiço was a term first employed in the 16th and 17th centuries by Portuguese and Dutch merchants to describe the use of worn objects with the capacity to control or act upon the human body, to behave not as an inert thing, but as a thing capable of agency. It is also important to note the difference between furs, which were not uncommon in early modern Europe, and the objects first identified as fetishes, which were unfamiliar to European merchants. But furs, like other clothes and other animal products, when worn, were thought to possess agency. Sometimes, as we will see in this second part, worn animal products could affect behavior, combat disease, and function as talismans, kind of good luck charms, through all of the senses. So we now turn to the second part and final part of the lecture. Anyone who owned and wore any type of fur in the early modern period would have looked at depicted fur garments with full awareness of how they felt, but also how furs smelled of the wearer and smelled of the scents and perfumes used to treat the garments. These scent memories could capture the allure and even sexual desire of the wearer. Visitors to Italy in the 16th century, for example, warily observed women at markets in Venice who would smell too exuberantly the pelts of animals known for their sexual wantonness, and inferred that these women had similar lascivious habits. Even more moderately behaved wearers would treat their garments with perfume derived from civet cats and ambergris. Tanners and furriers needing to counteract the odors associated with processing and dyeing animal skins and furs became experts at perfume making, oftentimes writing treatises on both topics. For the same reasons, glove makers and perfume makers belonged to the same guild of muschieri in 16th century Venice. Consumers of fragrances also believed that specific odors purified the air and kept the users healthy and free of diseases such as the plague. Efforts to protect and adorn oneself with fragrance were considered both necessary, pleasurable, and fashionable. You could see this would have contained a kind of fragrance here. Sitters who wore furs and carry pelts and portraits oftentimes don pomanders, a ball made for perfumes. They would wear those on a chain, such as in Titian's Woman in Blue, La Bella, or beaded jewelry that would contain perfumed paste or fragrant herbs and flowers, as in Parmigianino's Antea, this necklace here. Not a Venetian painting, but I just couldn't resist including it, so there it is. They would, in the beaded jewelry, contain perfume paste or fragrant herbs and flowers. All of these familiar depicted items must have cued in the viewers of the painting some degree of sensory response and remembrance. The Renaissance history of smell is difficult to reconstruct, in large part because, as for any historical period, language fails to capture exactly how things smell, and inevitably comparative or metaphorical descriptions only approximate the experience of odors. The sense of smell and of perfume derived from animals more specifically began increasingly in the 16th century to serve as metaphors, to characterize the kinds of intimate love relationships that these same sensuous half-lengths of images of women with furs and pomanders reflected and cultivated. Here we have this female figure holding this perfume vase, a vase of perfume, container of perfume. In the play La Veneziana by the Paduan playwright Ruzzante, the female protagonist Angela tells her beloved, with whom she has spent the night, that she wishes he could be like a small container of civet. I want all of this body for me, mouth, eyes, nose, legs, arms, and everything. I wish that you were a vase of civet so that I could carry you in my breast, always, always. He could pervade her skin and be absorbed by her nose. Aren't the depictions of scented animal garments and adornments, the furs, the pelts, the gloves, the pomanders, asking viewers to approach these depictions with the same mindset, or rather sense set? We can all probably call to mind the scent of someone or understand how precious someone's scent, the scent of their clothes, can be when they are no longer with us. The belief that the envelopment and saturation of the human body with animal products affected external behavior and outcomes, such as desirability to the beloved, safeguarding against disease, and promoting good health, extends to the fur fashion of carrying so-called zibellini, oftentimes, but not exclusively, made from the sable fur which gives them their name. Zibellini were full-body pelts that included the body, 4 extremities, sometimes with feet and claws, as you can see in this example here, and heads of animals from the weasel family, sable, ermine, and marten. Zibellini were made from animals that were preserved intact, as in Parmigianino's Antea, which you can see over her shoulder, heading towards her glove, or from pelts to which were attached gold or silver feet, and more commonly jeweled heads. There are a few surviving examples of jeweled heads, including this one on the screen, produced in mid-Cinquecento northern Italy, with jeweled eyes interspersed within enameled designs, which suggest that the depicted versions align with actual practice, and with a tongue and teeth that move. The pelts were laid around the wearer's neck and shoulders or draped over the arm and usually attached with a chain to a girdle or belt that was clasped around the woman's midsection. Zibellini often were given to women at the time of their marriage. For example, Mario Sonudo noted in a diary entry from 1525 that the newlywed niece of Doge Andrea Gritti received a heavy silver casket containing a lovely Zibellino, a small stuffed animal with a covering made for its head, to which is attached a gold chain. Portraits frequently reinforce the association of Zibellini with childbirth, within marriage, by depicting mothers who wear the pelts alongside their children. The tradition perhaps emerged from the mythological association between weasels and childbirth that developed from bestiaries. The specific origin of the female practice of wearing Zibellini is not exactly known, but it seems to have begun in northern Italian courts, and specifically those attached to Beatrice d'Este and Isabella d'Este. The sisters were not only fashionable brides and mothers, but were regularly acquiring animal products, furs, gloves, and musk, as well as living animals for pets and display. They were also living in a court environment in which clothing could be invested with meaning and be thought of as affecting specific outcomes. Baldassare Castiglione, author of The Courtier and occasional courtier himself, regularly described events in his letters through the lens of what everyone was wearing, as well as requested from his mother furs and clothes for himself and his colleagues. This preoccupation returns in a dialogue in The Courtier, in which the participants discuss whether clothing means anything and conveys anything about the wearer. As part of the conversation, Federico Fregoso acknowledges how clothing possesses talismanic powers. And as it is recorded that when Darius had the Persian sword, which he wore at his side, made over into the Macedonian style the year before he fought with Alexander, this was interpreted by the soothsayers to mean that the people into whose fashion Darius had transformed his Persian sword would come to rule over Persia. Just so, our having changed our Italian dress for that of foreigners strikes me as meaning that all those for whose dress we have exchanged our own are going to conquer us, which has proved to be all too true. For now, there is no nation that has not made us its prey. Not all of the interlocutors uphold this view, though, with Cesare Gonzaga countering in a sense that the man makes the clothes rather than that the clothes make the man. However, Federico gives voice to a belief, widely held among members of all social strata, that worn objects of all kinds could possess apotropaic powers. Precious stones, natural matter such as coral, and animal matter such as teeth were kept on their own, oftentimes in decorated boxes, as well as fashioned into wearable jewelry, such as the necklaces of animal teeth placed around the neck of a nursing infant that both protected the child and encouraged dental development. The use of amulets arose not from a sinister belief in enchantment, but from ideas generated from natural philosophy that connected nature to the divine world and sourced healing cures from the natural world. Such thinking, rather than antithetical to Christian beliefs, fostered the use of amuletic material in devotional objects. Amber and coral were among the most popular material for prayer beads. The recipients and users of these amulets were most frequently, although not exclusively, women, who more routinely faced physical and spiritual challenges, such as childbirth, that were also occasions for gifts. Zibellini, especially those decorated with gold and encrusted with precious stones, certainly seemed to fit within a category of objects that included crystals to wear during childbirth. But unlike most talismans, which are usually and primarily selected for their function rather than for any aesthetic reasons, Zibellini display a high level of artistry and workmanship to accomplish a hybrid mimetic rendering. A few surviving pelts have a movable tongue and real whiskers, as I mentioned before, as exemplified by this head in the Walters collection in Baltimore in the United States. Even those Zibellini without added jeweled ornaments have been treated and prepared to display open eyes with gems for eyeballs and their own sharp teeth. Is the Zibellini a bejeweled fur, an ornate form of taxidermy, a fashionable accessory, a trophy, a simulacrum of a pet, a wonder of art and nature? The Zibellino stands at the intersection of multiple types of art practices, which are informed by and reflective of multiple systems of knowledge involving animals. Bound up in these practices and systems are narratives of longing, of wonder, beauty, remembrance, death, and violence that are made more prominent and assertive in the representations of Zibellini in portrait types with female sitters. Their promise as talismans to facilitate the successful end to longing. In some cases, an easy labor and delivery is just one facet of their role in these paintings. Close observation of depicted Zibellini portraits reveals unexpected animation of these presumably lifeless accessories, and consequently complex interaction with the portrayed female sitters. And I'll point out the Zibellini here in all of the portraits, and I'll move to details so you can see them. The heads, whether given a bejeweled head or not, are often turned toward the wearer and very frequently display their fierce teeth. Sometimes, as in Titian's Eleonora Gonzaga, I'll go backwards, here, this painting here, the sitter holds onto the fur body while the head attached to the woman's girdle appears to stare somewhat threateningly at the sitter. Here. Parmigianino's Antea resembles an animal handler or tamer as the animal bares its teeth and seems to bite down on her gloved hand. The same situation occurs in Lotto's Lucina Brambati, where the meeting of her bare white hand and golden tooth amulet contrasts with the Zibellino head that looks ready to attack. The connecting chain heightens the sense of impending violence by suggesting that the creature needs to be restrained rather than elegantly connected as a luxury accessory to the adorned sitter. The beauty of the female sitters, the attention lavished on their carefully rendered clothes, the obedience and tenderness of the other living creatures, oftentimes small dogs and children, here, small dog, provide a visual contrast to the beautiful yet dangerous seeming beasts. The Zibellini visualize the agency of the fetish or talisman that is the worn animal. They attract and fight back. They seduce while often becoming objects of violence. They manifest quite literally or physically the usually figurative or conceptual fighting or pushing back against the artificial division between human and animal. The preserved animal, a victim of violence restored to wholeness and frozen in a display of violence, participates in and contributes to the anxious and threatening project of observing and representing human female beauty. All of them, women and animals, are gorgeous, violent beasts. The fraught project of representing women as similar to taxidermied non-human animals winds its way through some of the most foundational early modern writings on art. One of the beginning obstacles repeatedly voiced in these treatises was that the proportions of the female body, unlike those of the male body, were impossible to theorize or generalize. Female bodies were relegated to the category of the difficult and disobedient other, which included non-human animals. Right? Usually the proportions of women is given alongside these other animals. Also difficult to locate was the existence of the ideal beautiful woman, who, following the popular story recounted in Pliny's Natural History of Zeuxis and the Maidens of Croton, was an imaginary composite that had to be constructed from 5 different women. Lyric poetry reinforced the necessity of dividing beautiful women into parts in order to represent them. Relying on the poetic device of the blason, poets cataloged the physical parts of the beloved and made metaphorical comparisons between her corporeal features and beautiful things such as vases. Elizabeth Cropper identified this poetic tradition as central to the depiction of female sitters in portrait-type paintings, particularly so-called sensuous half-length paintings that seem unattached to a specific historical identity, primarily because of their nudity. These poems also seem to be relevant sources and contexts for thinking about the representation of Zibellini in female portraits, despite the fact that many of the sitters in these paintings are associated with named individuals. Even though, as mentioned earlier, neither weasels or furs makes a showing in this lyric poetic tradition, precious gems and metalwork, as well as non-human animals, generically categorized, frequently function as metaphors in lyric poetry to describe aspects of the beloved, as well as types of behavior provoked in the lover. Petrarch, writing about his beloved Laura, admires how her head was fine gold, her face warm snow, ebony her eyebrows, and her eyes 2 stars, pearls and crimson roses. Where gathered sorrow formed ardent, beautiful words, her sighs flame, her tears crystal. Other poets writing in the Petrarchan mode observe the lucidity and brightness of their beloved's gold and gem-like faces. These metaphorical qualities form the basis for recommendations and standards for female beauty in Cinquecento treatises, which describe ears that should be colored like rubies and so on, and most likely informed how viewers thought of the bejeweled faces of Zibellini, not as a symbol of the beloved who holds the animal, but as more generally evocative of the lyric tradition which inspired the rendering of these beautiful women. There is nothing neutral about the head of the sought-after beloved, much like the highly wrought Zibellini heads, or trophies of the hunted animal head. Similarly, frequent references to the wildness of the beloved or the resemblances between the lover and an animal find resonance in the teeth-bearing Zibellino. Petrarch, for example, casts himself as the besieged animal, pulled by mad desire from the nocturnal and diurnal rhythms of animal life. He casts himself as the wretched animal, as the woodland animal who wanders, and sometimes as the lazy animal. Vulnerability and power both characterize the experiences of the lover and beloved and their shifting roles of pursuer and pursued, much like the instability of the now dead and leashed animal, which nonetheless seems animated by its fierceness, and of the woman who possesses the dead animal while simultaneously unaware of the imminent seeming attack. To conclude, the depicted Zibellini, as well as the representations of other worn animals and animal products discussed in this lecture, suggest that there is the thinnest of distinctions in early modern European practice between the forbidden, uncivilized, unfamiliar, and non-European fetish, and the accepted, privileged, familiar European talisman. Many of the artworks discussed here, consider, for example, the depicted Zibellini's bared, gnashing teeth, emphasize the ways in which these existing cultural practices in Venice and northern Italy endowed animals with agency before the widespread disparagement of the non-European fetish as an object in practice that was primitive and unintellectual. The depicted worn animals in the artworks considered in this lecture promoted a similar culture of magical and imaginative thinking with familiar animals that depended on entanglements between human and animal, the known and the unknown. Through representation, worn animals could be made to be wondrous and possessing power, even occasionally strange, and certainly far more complicated than simply signs of a wealthy sitter. Thank you.
Modern contemporary person, it was particularly illuminating, but I think that what you've presented here transcends also its historical period, particularly with attention to some of the psychosexual symbols and relations, as well as phenomenological viewership that these images relay to us. I loved what you said about the sense set that it might sort of conjure within viewership. I wanted to just begin our question and answer question by a question of my own, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Those of you who are watching online, you can also enter questions in the chat and I can relay them. What I'd like to ask actually has to do with the cultivation of these animals. I'm curious if I'm sure you've looked into this and it's probably addressed elsewhere in your research, but I'm curious about the actual raising and cultivation of these animals specifically for this highly luxurious usage. How does that figure into your reading and this relationship between wealth and desire and gender, and maybe more particular to how these animals are cultivated or brought into Venice in particular? Thank you.
Well, most of the actual kind of cultivation of them in terms of the raising of them, if I'm understanding the question, is something that happens before they even arrive here. So when they are arriving here, they're then processed in order to be made into these garments. And so in that way, I think it actually does relate to this idea of what you're asking in terms of ideas of power and gender, in the sense that you know, these animals are they're basically you know, the skin is peeled off and then suspended and basically converted into something other than what it was. So that idea of the power of shaping an animal is something that I think can also relate to a lot of the discussions around how women should shape themselves too. But in terms of the actual cultivation, that is, at least according to my research, but if someone has other information, I'm eager to hear it, but that was something that happened elsewhere, except for maybe some of the more domestic furs. I'm not sure
That's
if that...
really interesting. Yeah, I'm just curious about more of that kind of raising and preparation of the animal body, particularly in these poses, and how I think some of the intricacies there are really kind of fascinating relative to the cultivation even of portraiture, right, to present kind of a certain self, but also a certain animal self. In any case, at this time, I open it up to questions in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. They're bringing the microphone to you.
Is that
Yes.
good?
Yes.
There. Thank you, Dr. Cranston. It was a multi-layered talk, intense. I can see the book, actually. So I'm just wondering, with the accessories, and when you speak about fetish as it was understood in the 16th century, and the agency of these objects, have you found in your research that in addition to the animal itself and the symbolism and what the sitter is wearing, the analysis as well as the actual gems that, for example, when you had that head with the eyes and the tongue and things like that, that the actual gems that they contain, that they also have these talismanic properties, and that I know you were saying it happens at the intersection of so many different meanings. Trying to get at my question, but if also those gems and the other things that the creature itself was adorned with added to those talismanic or apotropaic properties.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a great question, and I think you're absolutely right to note that, because these were not selected just randomly, and they had associations with them, and they're also sourced from other places too, which is something that I haven't looked into, but your question is making me think that that's on my now new to-do list, to look into that, because I think, you know, there's the metaphoric use of those gems like emeralds, pearls, rubies, things like that. But clearly, so that can, I think, contribute to the decision to include those particular gems that we see. But I also think that there are some Zibellini that have some other types of gemstones that are placed on them, and even the ones that we saw on the Walters head are coming from other locations, and so it would be interesting to kind of see how that's treated. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that those have very specific properties in terms of what they can affect. Just, do you mind waiting for the microphone?
Thank you. It's just sort of like a 1B question. Is it in their configuration as well? Because when you talk about the philosophy and, you know, natural philosophy, if there's something that's being mapped, perhaps even with the constellations, and if there's some kind of, and because they were meant for women and given at marriage. I'm also wondering if the configuration or the layout of the gems themselves could be mapped against something kind of, as a talismanic symbol.
I absolutely think so. I don't know specifically, but I think there is, and I think also something that I didn't talk about for this particular one is with the enamel work. That this is sometimes thought of as being the dove of the Holy Spirit. That the enamel work is also, in some ways, trying to connect up with this kind of supernatural function that this object could have. So I think your instinct is very much spot on for this. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, and thank you for that very stimulating lecture. Wonderful connections and so many different layers that you address. I wanted to go back to the idea of women and animals and males and animals, because even though there is this wide practice of creating analogies between women and the wild animals that need to be tamed, etc., controlled, I mean, we cannot avoid thinking of the way in which males are compared to different kinds of animals, and the way in which wearing a fur also imparts certain characteristics or signifies for the male wearer. So I'm thinking, are you going to consider that as well? And secondly, having done all this work on the Zibellini, how do you look now at, let's say, the lady with the ermine as a Zibellino of sorts?
I was really hoping no one would ask me this question. I just want to confess at the outset before I answer it. But so I actually am not dealing with animals and males who are wearing animals in the same way that I'm dealing with these female sitters. And there's certainly, I think, a lot of really interesting work to do on that. And certainly recent scholars like Tim McCall have worked on ideas of masculinity. I was more interested in a different expression of power, where the wearer was much more the victim of the clothing, as opposed to what we see oftentimes with the male clothing, where it can be much more of a kind of outward statement of power, or channeling the animal to kind of like a boost of masculinity. So that was why I decided to just focus on the female sitters. But I do think there's a lot of really interesting work that can be done, and I think a lot of scholars are working on currently. So that's a deliberate omission on my part. And then as far as the woman with an ermine, I don't know what to do with I don't know what to do with that portrait. I find it confusing, I find it challenging, but I definitely think it's something I need to attend to, because, as the living animal that could be, made into some kind of worn, lifeless animal, it becomes a kind of interesting counterpoint to these kind of lifeless animals that these sitters are wearing. But that's my way of trying to elegantly defer on answering about the woman with the ermine. But I think there's a lot of interesting work to do that. And I know that there are a lot of scholars who also aren't sure if it's an ermine, and that's also in dispute as well. But I think rethinking how living animals are interacted with by portrait sitters is a really important thing to consider. I started the lecture, I don't think the slide is adjacent to this one, or else I'd find it, but the Federico Gonzaga with the dog, and no longer seeing the dog as solely a sign of fidelity, but really thinking more about that relationship that's being shown within the portrait, and kind of investigating a little bit more deeply what exactly is happening between human and animal, and not thinking about the animal solely, the dog solely as an emblem of Federico Gonzaga, even with all of the possible objectives of that image as a possible invitation for marriage, or other ways in which one could think about that portrait. So thank you for your question. I'll get back to you once I've thought it through a little bit more.
Hello, okay. Thank you so much for all of that information. I am honored to be here and to listen to you speak on this. Something that I'm really interested in is all of these are focusing on fur as the product, and I love how you commented on or showed the photo of the woodcut of the process. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the division of class between those who process, those who were artisanal furriers who were doing the work in ateliers, and who they were in relation to their clients.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and thank you for being here. So a lot of what I relied on in my research is something you probably are familiar with, but this kind of magisterial study on fur by Robert Delors. And that was one of the primary sources for me in terms of just understanding that kind of hierarchy. And there also have been some other studies, and I'm just trying to call back Dennis Romano, a historian, who has a chapter in one of his books devoted to the fur guild or the furriers in Venice and how they would have worked. And there was definitely a real hierarchy, as you could expect, like any kind of atelier, right, of making, with a lot of the master furriers overseeing then, a pretty extensive workshop, with some of them never even going to see those furs process. And I think it's Romano who in his book talks a lot about how they spent money, how they were taxed, and they were many of them did very well for themselves. And so I don't know if I can answer more specifically than that, but there certainly is a wide body of scholarship that would probably address that question a little bit better than I can. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. It was very interesting, and my question is maybe from the environmental history, which is my perspective. Do you think that on the basis of those sources, we can see some link between, or some link to the dynamic which took place in the 16th century when we looking at the history of commodification of animals in this time, we clearly see the expansion of grounds available to Europeans. Say if what I studied was the history of fur hunting in the north of Russia, and the 16th century is the time, in fact, when Russians killed one population of fur animals after another, moving eastwards in the North Eurasia. And so can we see how those populations exchange each other on the shoulders of the European nobility? That's my question. Thank you.
That's a really interesting question, and I think I just was alluding to it at the beginning of the lecture, but one of the reasons why these secondhand fur markets become so important within Venice is precisely because the supply of ermine and the other furs start to dissipate in the 16th century because of all of these, this overhunting and exploitation of these populations. So, did you? Right. They finally came to the really But there is, so you are more of an expert on that than I am. The part I know about is just what became available here. and what became available here was very different. It had to be more squirrel and, you know, other fur, rabbit, things like that, that could, dormouse was another, that could be found a little bit more easily. And so it's putting a little bit of pressure, at least in the early 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century, on this kind of new supply of furs that had been thought of as, you know, these more luxurious items. So, you know, after this time period, I can't say for sure. From what I've looked at, it seems like it kind of, the import stalls a little bit in terms of what's coming into Venice specifically, at least according to some of the archives. But it sounds like you have some other information to supply about what happens in the later 16th century.
No, to me it just sounds like a story of very strange shifts in the trade there.
Yes, absolutely.
When the Russians actually in the late 16th century, they started killing those hundreds, thousands animals in the Siberia, but they somehow disappear from the European market. So where are they then?
Right.
That's my point.
Right, yeah, it's a very good point. And it's one that Delort tries to kind of actually put numbers to in his study of the fur trade. And then there's another, I think she's a British scholar, Mary Veal, who writes about Russia and the fur trade specifically, and really talks about the 13th and 14th centuries, and then doesn't really attend to this later 16th century explosion of fur availability in Siberia. So, but that's all I know.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you for your question. Now I have to look into that.
If possible, we have a question from someone online. The comment comes from Callie Buckley, who says, I think there are a lot of overlapping considerations with ivory, so I am also interested in the question of gems and the overall talismanic properties of entire ensembles. Could you speak to that?
I can speak to it insofar as essentially just talking about the ways in which these kinds of materials are used for good luck charms, are used in prayer beads and things like that. And there's a lot of scholarship done recently on this issue in particular. And so this first, I think, really started at least in American scholarship by Jackie Masacchio, who talks a lot about coral, for example, as well as she's one who talks about the teeth, animal teeth, which wouldn't be in that category of ivory and gemstones, but but there certainly is a kind of, like I was mentioning earlier, a kind of deliberate choice around which kinds of gems or materials are chosen and the kind of meaning that they have. And I think that a lot of that idea of the talismanic power comes from the fact that these are, of course, rare, but they also are being sourced from other places. And that's something I think that also deserves some kind of consideration too, as we talk about the possibility of a kind of greater openness on the part of especially early modern Europeans to this kind of talismanic culture that we tend to think of really as only being maligned by this idea of a kind of non-European fetish. From my vantage point, it seems like this kind of magical thinking is extremely pervasive, even down to the kinds of metals and stones that are used to stitch certain materials. So I think it certainly is a lot of work to do on that, and I think there's a lot of interest now in looking at clothing, and I'm sure there's probably somebody who's working on exactly that. So just not in maybe a published form that I've encountered.
Thank you, Dr. Cranston. Callie had a quick clarification, I think, and follow up. I guess the question is whether you've seen overlap with the furs and ivory, which also has connections with feminine beauty.
Can you just repeat the last part? I'm sorry, the overlap between furs and ivory, and then you just clipped out a little bit.
Which also has connections to feminine beauty.
Thank you. Yeah. You know, I have to admit that I'm not super familiar with ivory in particular, since there isn't any ivory in these examples. There is this kind of, I think probably, maybe it could be argued that there's a simulation of it with the enamel work, but in the white enamel work, but there's not a widespread use of ivory in these. But there certainly could be a connection. But I think, for me at least, you know, there is this, I think that gems and ivory, these precious materials, are a little bit different from the furs in that there isn't that kind of association of these having some kind of animate quality to them. And that to me is what makes them of particular interest. I think they're part of this continuum of the talisman that you could, where you could place the gemstones and things like that. But I think it carries with it a different connotation and a whole different process of acquisition and preparation that in the end probably makes them a little bit more distinctive from one another, at least in the way that I'm thinking about it.
Thank you so much. I'm not there to see, but it seems like maybe there aren't additional questions in the room.
There are.
Oh, okay. Please, let's have those questions.
So again, along with everyone else, thank you so much for a really stimulating and also a poetic talk in many ways. I was thinking as you were talking, in particular describing the range of different animals that could be present on a single body, the different furs, the zibellino, for example, and gloves, all from different animals, and especially something about the man with the glove has always reminded me of the actual process of the body of the painting itself and canvas, and the common use of sizing using animal glues. And I wondered if you have been thinking about not just representation, but also the almost physical relationship between the materials of the painting itself and what is represented and the ideas that are embodied. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I've been thinking about it a lot because if you read more of Cennino's Libro dell'Arte, he talks extensively about the ways in which one needs to use animals for the materials of art. So, you know, down to recommending that once you finish throwing the bones under the table from your meal, that you pick them all up, grind them, and make gesso. But there are the squirrel tails made for paintbrushes, and then also just, you know, thinking about for pens made with you know, feathers, with quill pens made with feathers, and the idea that at some point in every artist's career, they would be tasked with the preparation of those materials. And even painters like Titian, who are working with oil paint, a lot of times those are stored in animal bladders too. So to me, it just seems as though animals are haunting all of these artworks, especially oil on canvas. But it feels to me like they really sort of make their presence felt of course, when they're being their most mimetic, representing themselves as fur, fur representing fur, but also with the visible brush strokes and sometimes the leaving behind of parts of the paintbrush, so you actually have parts of squirrel that could be in it. So I think it's something that we need to kind of reintegrate in terms of how we think about looking at these artworks, and even just reintegrate in terms of how we think about what daily life was like, you know, even here in Venice with animals wandering around and having that line that we think of, you know, human and animal and inside and outside really being very obscured. Thank you for your question. I think we have no more questions in the room. I don't know, I don't mean to speak for the room, but I think I'll pass it back to you, Tenley.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, to everyone online, where we had record numbers for this lecture. So thank you to everyone, and thank you all for being here in person. And of course, let's join together and thank Dr. Cranston together for her wonderful, wonderful intervention and scholarship. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, I hope everyone enjoys the cocktails and aperitivo in the cloisters. I wish I were there with you, but should be a lovely celebration and evening. And with that, I will sign off. Grazie a tutte, grazie Jody, and I will hope to see you in person at some point.
Thank you so much, Tenley.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.